The recording now. We welcome back the Reverend Bob Tucker, who's retired after serving the First Congregation Church in Houston for nearly 30 years. He's also the interim minister of Houston's First Unitarian Universalist Church. He and Maggie have often visited us before the pandemic started and a little bit after, usually once a month. And he inspires us with his wisdom, experiences, and thoughtful insights. In his youth and volunteer activities, Bob has been a child advocate, helped found and continues to serve on the board of Justice for Children. Also on the board of Houston Area Women's Shelter, a rape crisis counseling and women's shelter. And he is going to have a story for all ages for his program, which he calls Who Tells Our Story. Bob?
Bob, unmute.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's very nice to have an extra hour of sleep, although I must say I'd prefer just doing away with all this daylight savings. And I think there's more movement toward that. The story for all ages is the story of Ona Judge. Ona Judge was born on the cusp of our War of Independence. However, she was not independent born. I'm getting feedback. Other people getting that?
Yeah, we need to turn off the mic at the podium.
Okay. Ona Judge was part of the Martha Custis family heritage brought into her marriage with George Washington. Ona's father was white, but his mother was a slave. And given the law at that time in the state of Virginia, that which is born follows the womb. She was born a slave in 1662. She was enslaved by the Washington family, first at the family's plantation in Mount Vernon, and later, after George Washington became president, at the president's house in Philadelphia, which was then the nation's capital city. She became Martha Washington's personal attendant. In her early 20s in Philadelphia, she learned that Martha Washington intended to transfer her to her granddaughter, who was known to have a horrible temper. And so with the aid of Philadelphia's free Black community, she fled to New Hampshire and there lived as a fugitive slave for the rest of her life. She married, had children, converted to Christianity. The Washington family did not want to risk public backlash in forcing her to return to Virginia. And after so many years of failing to persuade her to return quietly, the family just gave up and let her be. In an interview in 1846, Ona said she had received no education under the Washingtons. More is known about her than any other enslaved person from the Mount Vernon plantation because she was twice interviewed by abolitionist newspapers in the mid-1840s. Well, why learn about Ona Judge? Well, our Texas legislature, in their infinite wisdom, said we should. In section 28.002 of the amended State of Texas Education Code, it's determined that Ona, or along with Sally Hemings, Thomas Jefferson's sexual slave, needed to be remembered along with all the other prominent persons of our country's founding. So now some of you will know around the supper table when you ask either your child or your grandchild the question, well, what did you learn in school today? and your child talks about own a judge, you will know the person your child is talking about. Parenthetically, let me say that this was the first time that I had rummaged around in the Texas Constitution and the Texas Education Code, and I found the strangest things popping out. Why was I mucking around in these documents? Well, I was looking up a bill of a Texas representative from the Woodlands who wanted to protect the tender minds of our children from information that causes an individual to, in the words of House Bill 3979, quote, feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress on account of the individual's race or sex. In other words, he was trying to push aside some of the new trends that are attempting to take place in the schools. Well, that particular bill was passed by both houses, and Governor Greg Abbott signed it. That's just one part of the American story, and a part that is legislated by our legislature for our children in Texas. Today, I want to talk about the American story, the story that we tell to our children, but also the story that we tell to ourselves. You've seen the polls taken over the years, which have told us that we Americans, adults as well as children, are quite ignorant of our history and our national culture. Yet in this year's Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania, the pollsters found that, among other things, adult knowledge is actually improving. But still, 17% of American adults can't name any of the rights guaranteed under the First Amendment, and 1 out of 5 could not name any branches of government. But the good news is that 56% of American adults can now name all 3. But irrespective of what we know or don't know, we certainly want our children to know it all. American history has multitudinous facts and personages occupying the pages. What facts and individuals do we select to teach to our children? That's not a question we ordinarily have to think about, since we have in our textbook a kind of standard history taught to us. I say standard because history books in the last half century didn't deviate much from the commonly understood story. The exception to that is a book, A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, Z-I-N-N. Not an official textbook, it nevertheless is found in most libraries, even school libraries. Zinn told many of the unsavory stories of America that's not in our history books and deemed too volatile for high school students. However, what's happened in the last few decades is that the standard textbook history of this country has gotten somewhat dismantled, and there's been a resetting of the American story. 3 of them have occurred in my lifetime and in the lifetime of many of you as well. The first dismantling was the civil rights movement, leading eventually, among other things, to the removal of the historical statues and the Confederate flag. A few decades ago, could you have imagined that in Richmond, Virginia, the second capital of the Confederacy, the 12-ton, 21-foot tall Robert E. Lee statue on Monument Avenue would be removed? That was on the 21st of September, just a little over a month ago. I assume that new American history textbooks now will be rewriting Robert E. Lee not as a hero, but as a traitor who fought for human enslavement, vastly increased the bloodshed of the Civil War, and made some embarrassing tactical military mistakes. Well, that's not the Robert E. Lee that I grew up with in school, even in the northern state of Minnesota. He was a hero. He was a military genius. He was a gentleman. And the civil rights era did more than change laws. It also changed our understanding of our history. And how that works out in the American story is yet to be developed, but it certainly will cause a change. The second dismantling of American history in my lifetime was the Vietnam War. Past history books viewed America as the white hat in the world, unselfish in doing good. And often an example of that was World War II and the Marshall Plan, rebuilding Europe. They played a large part in that perception. Countering that, the Vietnam dead. 58,220 American military personnel are on the wall in Washington, D.C. And then there are the non-military personnel who died, plus the soldiers of our allies, plus an estimated 888,000 North Vietnamese, plus the 430,000 South Vietnamese. And we have the Pentagon Papers informing us that what we did in this slaughter was based on lies. To that, I'm sorry to add, is our chaotic departure from Afghanistan, shredding a sense of American can-do competence. And how that gets worked into the history books is going to change the story of America as taught to our children, and probably is changing the story of how we ourselves think about American history. The third dismantling of assumed truths took place more recently in August of 2019. The New York Times retold the American story in what they called the 1619 Project. The 1619 Project, and quote, aims to reframe the country's history by placing the consequences of slavery and the contribution of Black Americans at the very center of the United States national narrative. So that's a deliberate attempt to change the American narrative. The project was first published in the New York Times for the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the first enslaved Africans in the English colony of Virginia. The selection of that date is quite arbitrary, since actually Africans had been in other parts of North America since the 1500s. And historians have pointed out that the first enslaved Africans arrived in North America in 1526. But still, the New York Times, in its 1619 Project, is focusing on that as the introduction of slavery into this country, and as they said, the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of the United States national narrative. Now, why did they put out this at the particular time they did? Well, I think it was quite done deliberately, because it overshadowed the 400th anniversary of the landing of the Pilgrims. But the pandemic has also sort of pushed aside that particular celebration. Significant controversy has centered over this project's claim that one of the primary reasons the colonists decided to declare their independence from Britain was because they wanted to protect the institution of slavery. That seems to have been a pretty far statement, far out. According to a Princeton University historian, the claim that there was a perceptible British threat to American slavery in 1776 is an ahistorical assertion, since the British abolitionist movement was practically non-existent in 1776. But countering that is the fact that many American founders, such as John Adams, James Otis, Thomas Paine, opposed slavery, and every state north of Maryland took steps to abolish slavery following the Revolution. While prominent historians have accused the 1619 Project of putting ideology before historical understanding. But the reason I spend time on that is that there is a deliberate attempt to retell the American story with that in mind. And the New York Times has actually developed and sent out hundreds of thousands of extra copies of their magazine issue distributed to schools, museums, and libraries. So that will be part of the discussion that's going to be taking place on how do we formulate the American story that we tell to our children and that we tell to ourselves. We live in a time in which there's a great amount of political conflict. And of course, we have such things as the critical race theory to contend with. And actually, I am a supporter of that only because that is the only thing on the national scene right now that is attempting to deal with racism. But I prefer Martin Luther King's approach in trying to bring people together rather than the critical race theory, which tends to separate people into racial groups. But all of this is tapping into something which is deep, an underlying debate about the nature of America and what it means to be American. How should we look at this country's principles as they applied to current questions? We just can't get rid of those kinds of questions, and they're generally answered by how we tell our national story. There are multiple stories available. And what it seems to me is that three events, as I said, in just a relatively short period of time, the civil rights movement, the Vietnam and Afghanistan, and the 1619 Project have all impacted the way we look at our country and the way historians are going to be telling our story in the future. One historian questions whether America has ever had a single unified story. And probably, he said that probably we have a dominant story or a succession of dominant stories, but those have changed over time and they have willingly or unwillingly been made to wrestle with competing stories. I wish there was a conclusion to this sermon, but I think that these things are fairly recent in our history, and it's going to take time to work out and then work in to the story that we tell. Our story is important. The Jewish writer Isaac Singer wrote, "When a day passes, it is no longer there. What remains of it? Nothing more than a story. If stories weren't told or books weren't written, humans would live like the beast only for the day. The whole world, all human life, is one long story. And we are one part of that long story, the American story. And how that story gets told and retold is something for our future." Thank you for your attention.